Hey there, welcome to another episode of Mike's Collection. I'm Mike, and the part of my collection that I'm going to be talking about today is the brand new wave of Godzilla ReAction figures from Super 7. So they've previously put out a wave of Godzilla ReAction figures last year in 2022, and now we're getting wave 2 in March of 2023. So these are pretty cool. It's another 6 figures. However, I only bought 5 of the figures from Wave 2. And yet, I still have 6 new Godzilla ReAction figures to show you. So, the thing is, we got, some new versions of Godzilla. That's going to be, I imagine we'll see that in every wave going forward. At least one Godzilla, maybe 2 Godzillas every time. Now, thus far, I've been buying all the different versions of Godzilla, even though they don't look that different. Like, it's pretty subtle, the differences between the Godzillas. And at some point, I might just say, I can't be buying all these things. Each one of these figures cost me about $25 Canadian. So, they're not cheap, and when they look almost identical. But anyway, at this point, I have been buying the Godzillas. Beyond Godzilla, we've got some brand new characters, which is super cool. But then the other figure that I passed on was another version of Mecha Godzilla. And this was him in mid-transformation. So even though I own all of the Godzilla DVDs, I've seen all of the movies, I don't have encyclopedic knowledge of them. Some of them I've only seen once, some of them I haven't seen for 20 years. So I don't know exactly how it all went down. But Mecha Godzilla, sometimes, I think probably most often when he's featured in the movies, because there isn't one continuity between all the Godzilla films. They've rebooted it several times. So we've seen Mecha Godzilla introduced for the first time several times. So I think usually he is something that is created by the humans to fight Godzilla. But I believe in one series of films, Godzilla was, bringing destruction. And, the humans were like, Godzilla's attacking us again. And then it was revealed after they blasted him that his skin melted off and he was a robot Godzilla underneath, and some aliens had basically built a robot Godzilla and were framing the real Godzilla for the damage. I think that's the storyline. I might not be 100% on that, but anyway, one of the figures Super 7 made in Wave 2 was a Mecha Godzilla mid-transformation. So from the top, from the kind of shoulders and head, it was Mecha Godzilla, but then from the shoulders down, he was regular Godzilla, so it was supposed to look like as his skin was melting off. And I just didn't feel that was an essential figure to my collection for the $25, because it wasn't a unique character. It wasn't even really a unique look. It's a Mecha Godzilla figure that I basically already have in a costume, so it's kind of very scene specific. I always think when I buy these toys, even though I don't actually play with them, I always think, how would I integrate these toys together if I was sitting on my bedroom floor as a kid and playing with them? With the Godzillas, I could justify multiple Godzillas through some sort of time travel story, or maybe they just are a bunch of different Godzillas that all hatched from the same nest or something. And I don't know, I could justify the Godzillas. But having a Mecha Godzilla that's got a half-torn costume, just like if they make a Spider-Man figure who's beat up and you can see his face showing through half of his costume, that just seems like it's too specific a moment and not like a whole extra version of the character. Anyway, so that's why I didn't buy mid-transformation Mecha Godzilla. It just didn't, I didn't feel I needed it. But anyway, we're going to take a look at the other figures in the wave. First, I'm going to show you them in package. I got these guys a couple of days ago, and I haven't opened them up yet, so I'm kind of dying to open them. But I wanted to show you them in package first, and then I'm going to shoot some close-up. You can see them outside the package. We'll do a little review. We'll compare to the previous releases and all that sort of stuff. So, let's start with one of the Godzillas. So this here is Godzilla 62. So this is based on his 1962 look. So Godzilla, he has had multiple movies, and they would tweak the costume, sometimes just slightly, sometimes he would get a whole new look. It seems like Super 7 is intent on giving us a figure of every version of Godzilla, every look he's ever had. So in Wave 1, we got Godzilla 54, based on the original movie, and Godzilla 57. And you can see that on the cross-promotion on the back of the package. It shows you Wave 1 and Wave 2. Now, if you can see those faces on the 4 different Godzillas along the top, they all look pretty different in the movies. But the figures... Where reaction figures are kind of simple in their sculpts anyway. Like, they're not really intended to be screen accurate. That I don't know if those 4 distinct looks that they're trying to capture, that they show on the packaging, really comes across in the figures. But I guess we'll get a better idea of that once I have them all opened up and we have all 4 Godzillas on screen together. But anyway, so there's him. It's a cool little shot of Godzilla. You see his mouth is kind of open there on the packaging, and the figure itself, he's got a mouth kind of slightly open. And otherwise, yeah, we'll take a look at the differences in a few minutes. Now here is Godzilla 84. So I was excited about this one because Godzilla 84 is probably the first Godzilla movie I ever saw. It was, the first big one that was released in America in my lifetime, being born in 78. The thing that sucks about this movie is it's the one I've seen the least often because I saw it as a kid, but it's tied up with some legal issues and they don't get to release this one on DVD. It wasn't available on VHS for a long, long time. So this is the only Godzilla film out of the about 30 of them that I don't have in my collection, just because Godzilla 84, like I said, legal issues. I'm not going to pretend to know exactly what it is, but this is kind of a fan favorite Godzilla of mine. So yeah, it's pretty cool. He does look different from the other guy. He looks like he's, at a glance, he's darker color, like he looks almost jet black, and his face is a different shape. He's got a different number of toes. His tail is different. It's hard to say. The middle, the main body might be the same on these two guys. But it is a little hard to tell, especially when they're in the packaging. So we'll pop them both open in a second and we'll take a look. Next up, so this guy's pretty cool. So this is Gigan. So he is a very bizarre looking monster. Very Power Rangers-esque in that his design is just crazy. He has kind of this spinning buzzsaw on his chest, and he's got these hooks, these big meat hooks for hands, and he flies around. He's got kind of one big cycloptic eye. It's, he kind of looks like a bird. He doesn't make a whole lot of sense. He's just goofy looking. But this is another kind of favorite of mine, just because it was one of the first Godzilla movies I owned. So even though 84 was the first one I saw, it wasn't until 1998. And at that point in time, I was working at Blockbuster Video. I was surrounded by movies. I was always a movie fan, but once you start working at the video store and you can rent all these movies for free, I started seeing way more movies and I started becoming much more of a cinephile. And the new Godzilla movie, the American-made Godzilla movie by Roland Emmerich, was coming out. And because of that movie coming out, they put out a new series of VHS of all the old Godzillas, and they all had consistent packaging, this new packaging. And Godzilla vs. Gigan was the first one I bought. And so yeah, it's one of the Godzilla movies that I'm probably more familiar with. And so I'm really happy to get this character. Now, I do have a Gigan figure in my collection. You probably can't see him, but he's up there on that. Above my Transformer shelves, I keep all my monster figures. So I've got some Godzillas and some dinosaurs. I've got a Rodan, and I've got a Gigan. But the Gigan I have is from his later appearances, where he's darker blue in color, and he's got red fins. So this is the first time I've ever gotten a figure of basically the version 1 Gigan. So this is really cool. And it's probably the first time a lot of North American fans will get this guy, because these guys were hard to get. I'm sure there's a lot of toys of this guy available in Japan, but not too many companies import them over. And whenever they make Godzilla figures, they always make Godzilla. Like, even the company that had the Godzilla license before Super 7 was NECA, and they made amazing Godzilla figures, and they were making Godzilla's appearance from like all the different movies as well, in the 6-inch scale, big and detailed, but they didn't have the rights to do any of the other Toho monsters, so we just get Godzilla after Godzilla after Godzilla. So I was really excited when Super 7 announced that they were going to be able to include other monsters in their waves of ReAction figures and Ultimates figures. So Wave 1, like, we got Mechagodzilla, we got Jet Jaguar, Rodan, Mothra, and now this time we're getting new characters, and for me, this is the first time ever getting a Gigan version 1. Now, probably my favorite, and probably a lot of people's favorite of the Godzilla, pantheon of characters, would be King Ghidorah. This is the 3-headed dragon. He was featured in Godzilla King of the Monsters most recently. And I think this guy's awesome. And this is a really fun figure. I'm glad to get it. But this is a character that I've got a couple of figures in my collection now. I've had this little rubbery one for a long, long time. And just last year, I got a really nice King Ghidorah in this scale from Mezco as part of their 5 points line. So I did a whole video before where I compared Wave 1 of Godzilla ReAction to Mezco's Wave 1 of their Godzilla 5 points figures. And it's a little bit like comparing apples and oranges, because these guys are meant to be simple, whereas Mezco's were much more screen accurate and highly detailed. So it depends on the kind of aesthetic you're into, I guess. So this guy he does look very cool, very simple, but I think the Mezco one is probably the more impressive figure. So that takes some of the shine off of this guy, but I am still very excited to get him. So then the last one here that I have to show you, this one's pretty cool. So this is Hedora. This is like the Smog monster. He's made up of basically pollution and sludge. And this is a character that I have never had before. So this was super exciting. In Wave 1, we had Mechagodzilla and Rodan and Mothra. All cool, but I have those guys in other versions, kind of bigger, hollow, rubbery figures. Jet Jaguar was the highlight of Wave 1 for me, because they hadn't made a figure of him, at mass retail in North America before, so I was excited to get him. In this wave, it's Hedora. So not an easy figure to get. Now, 5 points, like Mezco, they did beat Super 7 to the punch with this, in that they put out their own version of him, which is probably better, like more screen accurate. But I passed on that one because he came in a box set with another version of Godzilla, which looked a lot like the Godzilla they'd previously released, and the figure. And it came with a couple little miniature buildings, which looked awesome. But the whole set was about like $90, and I couldn't justify it for just 2 figures, one of which was basically a double of a figure I already had. So if they had packaged their Hedora alone, I probably would have bought it, and I would have been able to do a side-by-side, but they priced me out. So I'm glad Super 7 released this guy as a single-carded figure. He's big, way bigger than your average ReAction figure. Like, I'll do a little side-by-side later where I bring up, like I say, a G.I. Joe ReAction figure or something. And considering that these are the same price, even though I do kind of feel that ReAction figures are kind of overpriced in general, this guy much more justifies the price point, because there's just so much more plastic involved here. But yeah, he looks really cool. I'm excited to open this guy up. Now, I did say that I had 6 figures to show you, and that's because when I went on Super 7's website the other week, the day that these went on sale, they also had a surprise drop that I don't think they had announced previously. And they took their Marusan, I think is how you say it, Godzilla figure, which was an homage to the old rubbery style Godzilla figures I keep referring to up there. And so they had done a previous little miniature version of the Marusan Godzilla before. Anyway, they released it on the same day as Wave 2 launched in this new glow-in-the-dark version. So where the previous one was like a kind of a greenish gray, now we've got him in this kind of white and silver. And I think he's a lot of fun. Pretty cool packaging. So yeah, I'm going to open this guy up as well. So 6 new Godzilla ReAction figures. It's a good day when these things show up. And now that I've showed you them in the package, I'm excited to open them up. And yeah, we'll be back in a second to take a closer look. So the first figure that we'll look at outside of the box is Godzilla 1962. And if you're wondering what Godzilla movie came out in 1962, it was King Kong versus Godzilla. So this figure is based on his look from this film here. This is my DVD version. I hope we get a King Kong based on this movie. He looks ridiculous, but he's kind of awesome too. So yeah. I don't know if Super 7 has the rights to do that, but I hope they do. And here we are up nice and close. So he is a pretty cool figure. I really like these guys. Like with Super 7, as I mentioned, they're kind of overly simplified. I think that shows the most in the tail. All these ReAction figures have very small little tails, where in the movies Godzilla often had a much longer tail. But I understand why they do that, and I don't really mind because it makes them a lot easier to display on a shelf. Some of my NECA Godzillas are really tough to display because, you try and put them facing forward on a shelf, but then they've got this tail that comes back like 6 inches, and you can't put them on very shallow shelves and things like that. So yeah, I kind of like the little tail on these guys. So here you can see his, his dorsal fins. He's got the little open mouth. He's got some pink painted inside the mouth. He's got yellow eyes. There's not a whole lot more to say about this. The articulation is pretty standard for these, as it is on all ReAction figures. It's 5 points of articulation. So his head turns side to side. Not a ton, but, enough. His arms, up and down. Legs, forward and backward. And to the tail, yeah, the tail actually turns on this guy too. So these guys actually get an extra point of articulation compared to most ReAction figures because of the tail. So yeah, I like him a lot. Now I might as well bring up the other Godzilla and we'll do a comparison. So this is what they call Godzilla 1984. Now I mentioned earlier this was probably my first exposure to Godzilla films. Now, in Japan, this film was released in 1984 and it was called The Return of Godzilla. But when they brought it over to North America, they re-edited it, they added some footage with American actors, and they called it Godzilla 1985. So that's what I always knew it as. So this figure to me is really an 85 Godzilla rather than an 84 Godzilla. But, whatever, no matter. And he's pretty cool. So you can see he is different. And you might think, okay, sure, they changed up the heads. But I think he's different all the way through. Like if you look at their chest, this guy almost seems to have some sculpted pectoral muscles. Well, this guy does not. Their arms are obviously different shapes. Their legs are different. This guy has only got 3 toes. That guy's got 4 toes. The tails are different shapes. So, while they're similar, which makes sense because, they never changed Godzilla all that radically. If you're not paying attention, you might have thought that the Godzilla suit was the same, for the first dozen or so movies. But it did change ever so slightly each time. So yeah, I really like this guy's face sculpt. It reminds me of that 1985 movie poster, and which was also the cover to the VHS tape and everything that I remember so well. Yeah, he looks kind of chill, kind of neutral. He's not really snarling or anything. It's just kind of resting face. And yeah, and color-wise, it's hard to say. Like these guys look pretty similar, but I do think Godzilla 84 is a little bit darker, almost black, where this guy's more of a charcoal. So yeah, both very, very cool. Now, I'll bring up the Wave 1 Godzillas as well. So here we go. So these ones are based on earlier films. And they're much grayer as opposed to black. Now, the first film was black and white, so I don't know if that's what they're trying to capture here, if it's supposed to look like black and white film. And that's why when he went into color, they gave him more of the darker color scheme. But I am surprised. When I first bought these two figures, I thought that they were basically identical figures with different heads. It turned out I was wrong on that too. Like they also have different arms and they have different amounts of toes and all that stuff. And I wondered how much parts reuse we were going to get from Wave 1 to Wave 2. Now, don't quote me on this, but these look to be largely original pieces through and through, which is, it's pretty impressive. And I know the guys at Super 7 are big Godzilla fans. They take this license seriously. So I wouldn't put it past them to sculpt a whole new piece. If it was just simply a matter of making his dorsal fins a little smaller from one version to the next, I think they would do that. And yeah, so to the average person, like let's just say my wife, she would think these things are all identical to one another. But if you're a fan, you can see that these are different. Now, maybe before we move on from Godzilla, I mentioned the Mezco 5 points, so I would have done a comparison with him when I talked about those Wave 1 figures in my prior video. I'll just bring him out here again in case you didn't see my first video. You can see he's a little bit bigger. He's not quite the same scale, plus he's a lot more detailed, a lot more sculpted detail. You got a nice kind of paint wash to bring out the detail on the scales and stuff. So depending on your preferred look, you might want to stick with Mezco over ReAction, but I think there's room in my collection for both. I really like them both. And yeah, here's an old school Godzilla figure I had from the 90s. This was from a company called Trendmasters. So for a long time, this was the only Godzilla figure in my collection. And yeah, now he's all part of the gang. So now let's take a look at Gigan. So here he is next to my Godzilla vs. Gigan DVD. So this film was originally first released in 1972. As I said earlier, it was one of the first Godzilla VHS tapes I owned. I've since got rid of all my VHS tapes. I've rebought it on DVD. And someday I'll probably end up replacing it on a Blu-ray or a 4K or something. But anyway, you can see that poor Gigan didn't even make the cover of his own movie. Oftentimes, there were multiple monsters featured in the movies. So even if the movie was called Godzilla vs. Mothra, you might have had like 6 different monsters in there anyway. And similarly, you can see the silhouette of King Ghidorah on the movie there. So he was featured in this movie as well. But yeah, you'd think they would have put Gigan on the cover at least. So that's too bad. But yeah, Gigan appeared in a couple other movies. He came back the very next year in 1973's Godzilla vs. Megalon. And then he was back in Godzilla Final Wars back in 2004. And that's where he had that kind of the kind of bigger, meaner look. Now, speaking of that bigger, meaner look, here is the Gigan figure that I have in my collection. I've had this for several years now. Probably close to 15 years. I don't know. At least 10. I don't know. But yeah, you can see he's a big figure. But he is like hollowed out. He has very limited articulation. So yeah, it was cool. Like, I think that's a cool look. It definitely looks like an upgraded version of Gigan, but I just have a soft spot for the original appearance, so that's why I'm stoked to get this new little ReAction figure, which we'll take a closer look at right now. So sculpt wise and paint wise, I think Gigan looks great. He's got all this kind of little sculpted detail on his chest and throughout his body, those little scales. He's got his teeth, his beak, his like horns, his spikes, the fins. There's a lot going on with this guy. These big crazy meat hook hands, the saw, which it spun like a buzzsaw in his chest at some point. So yeah, pretty cool character. Articulation wise, same thing, arms, legs, head turns, and his tail turns a little bit as well. So you get 6 points with him. He's pretty cool. What else can we really say? Just scale-wise, I'll bring out one of those Godzillas again just to show you how he sizes up. So these guys are a pretty even match. I think the scale is pretty accurate to how he appeared in the films. So yeah, you can recreate those classic movie scenes with this really cool figure. I'm stoked to get this guy. So next up, we'll take a look at King Ghidorah. Now, I don't know if this look is based on any particular film. Ghidorah has appeared in a lot of Godzilla films. I would say he's probably appeared in the most, other than Godzilla, and perhaps maybe Mothra has him beat. But he first showed up in a movie with his own name as the title. So Ghidorah, the Three-Headed Monster in 1964, and this here is the special edition DVD for that film. Then he showed up again the following year in 65 for Invasion of the Astro Monster, which is this one here. And you can see at the bottom it says this film was also released as Godzilla vs. Monster Zero, So again, I think that was maybe the international title. Then he was back for Destroy All Monsters. As you saw a second ago, he was in Godzilla vs. Gigan. And then there was Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. Then he was in the Mothra films. Then he was in Godzilla, Mothra, King Ghidorah, Giant All-Out Monsters Attack. And then most recently in Godzilla, King of the Monsters. So yeah, he's been all over the place. Very cool character. His look has changed some from film to film, but again, I don't know if it's distinct enough that I would recognize which movie this one is based on. But I'm going to guess it's probably off of one of these early films. So here's a closer look at King Ghidorah. And he's a little bit taller, so I had to kind of push my camera back a little bit further to give us a little bit more room to take him all on screen at once. So yeah, he's a little taller, a little wider. He was always a pretty big, impressive creature on screen who definitely looked like he had an advantage over Godzilla most of the time. So yeah, some really nice detail on the heads. They all look to be pretty similar. I don't know if they're all the exact same sculpt, but his mouth is open just a little bit on each one. This one appears to be closed more than the other two. So I think they're all unique. Now for articulation, you can see all of the heads spin around a little bit. And then his wings, they are hinged so they can flap forward and backwards about that much. His legs, you can move them forward. And his tail, his two tails there, you can spin that a little bit too. So he's actually got more articulation than the other figures. I think that's about eight points of articulation there. So yeah, nice sculpt with the scales covering his entire body. Very cool. Scale wise, if I bring out a Godzilla here, you can see that Ghidorah is bigger. Not substantially so. I think in the movies he was bigger than this, but they've kind of had to scale him down, I guess, for this action figure. But yeah, it looks pretty good. Now just for some comparisons, I brought out my old Trendmasters Godzilla a moment ago. I can't remember if I bought these separately or they might have come in a 2-pack together. But here is my Trendmasters King Ghidorah from 1994. And this is a pretty cool figure. But yeah, this was the only Ghidorah figure in my collection until last year. And I always wanted something that was bigger and better. This guy, the wings don't move on this guy. The tail doesn't move. The only thing he can turn is his 3 heads kind of spin. But I didn't like that the heads were always sculpted looking downwards. He's just kind of gazing at his shoes. So the sculpt is nice, and the paint is nice. And it's not that different from this figure. Like, I've wanted an upgrade of this figure for years, and now I get this one, and I like this one better. But I could see somebody like, let's say my wife saying like, really, this is that much better than that one? And I could see where she would be coming from, because yeah, they're not that far off. Now the other one I want to bring in for comparison is the 5 points one from Mezco last year. Now this guy is pretty impressive. You can see with that sculpted detail on these heads and the paintwork, it really brings out the detail. I'd still like to have a bigger King Ghidorah in my collection, something to rival that Gigan that I brought out earlier. But this one is pretty big by comparison with these guys. Like, his wingspan is pretty impressive. And he's probably more to scale, where if you brought out one of these Super 7 Godzillas to have him fight King Ghidorah, that one's probably more in line with what you would have seen on film. So yeah, they're all pretty cool. Depending on how screen accurate you want your figures, or do you want them to be kind of simplified, that's kind of the charm of reaction figures in general, I think, is collectors want things that remind them of their childhood, which would be action figures of like the 70s and 80s. And, action figures back then just weren't all that detailed and everything. So there's some kind of charm that these guys have that this guy maybe lacks. But I think objectively it is definitely a better figure. But anyway, let's move on to Hedorah. So now we'll take a look at Hedorah. So you can see I've got him posed here with the Godzilla vs. Hedorah DVD. This movie was released in 1971. When it first came over to North America, I believe it was called Godzilla vs. the Smog Monster. But yeah, Hedorah is the character's name, so it's good that we've got the correct name on him now. We used to get that a lot on Godzilla Monster, like when he fights Hedorah, they would call him just the sea creature, things like that. They kind of simplified some of the names of the villains. Anyway, this guy's pretty cool. He's a fun character. In the movie, he's got two very distinct modes. He's got this kind of big lumbering mode, then he's also got his flying mode, where he's kind of like almost like a UFO. And in that, the pack that 5 Points put out, or that Mezco put out, you actually got both versions of Hedorah in that pack, which is kind of cool. So that pack has an advantage over this figure in that respect. However, that pack was much more expensive. So yeah, Hedorah has only made one other appearance. He showed up again in 2004's Final Wars, which is where they tried to cram every Godzilla character in there for at least a small cameo. But yeah, so he hasn't appeared a whole lot, pretty much just this film. So here's a closer look at him. I think this guy's great. Like I said, I've never had an action figure of him before, and up until last year, it seemed very unlikely. Like, I could have went on eBay and probably bought some Japanese import, but it probably would have cost me an arm and a leg, and they're not usually super high quality figures. Like I said, they're the kind of things that are kind of hollowy, rubbery things. They're not really collector items. The kind of thing you could probably go into, like, say, Chinatown and buy one at a market for your kids or something, but they might not even be officially licensed. So yeah, to get this guy here, this is pretty awesome. And he looks great. Like, he is a weird looking monster. And if he's not your cup of tea, then I guess you wouldn't like this figure. But for me, I always liked the look of this guy with his weird, like, sideways eyes. He's just a big glob of toxic waste, essentially. And I think the sculpt covers that really good. His hands look like they're dripping. His feet, he's got really big feet. Like, it looks like something out of Sesame Street almost, with these big bird-like feet. Just really cool. So he's got a good solid base. He's not going to fall over on your shelf. And he's big. Like, if we bring out a Godzilla here again for some comparisons. Let's bring him over here. So you can see just how much bigger he is. And then maybe I'll bring Ghidorah back out here. And you can see how he scales as well. So yeah, lots of different scales in here. And I think I mentioned earlier that I wanted to bring out a standard ReAction figure. So at the same time when I ordered these guys, I also ordered a new version of the Mummy from one of the Universal monsters. And I ordered this guy here. I'm not going to waste a lot of time talking about him in this video, but I'll talk about him in a future video. But basically, it's just a translucent pink version of the Mummy. And he's kind of fun. But anyway, this is the size of most ReAction figures you buy. So if you buy a G.I. Joe ReAction figure or a Die Hard ReAction figure or Scarface, somebody, this is the size they're going to be. This is the standard human size. So when you get him in here with these other ReAction figures, and they're the same price as him, you can see there's a lot more plastic going into some of these, Godzilla ones. Like, this guy is just a big, thick, solid hunk of plastic, so they're good size. And even though I often complain, and every time I post one of these ReAction figure videos, I get lots of comments of people complaining about the price of these figures, and I get it. ReAction figures, I think, are overpriced for what they are, but when you get a figure like this and this, it feels a lot more justified. So yeah, definitely a thumbs up from me for these characters here. So the last figure we have to take a look at is the glow-in-the-dark Marusan Godzilla. So this guy's pretty cool. This look is not based on any movie, so I don't have any DVDs to bring up to show you, because I think this is a matter of, companies making toys of characters that they just weren't putting in a whole lot of effort in back in the day. Like, so this is what a Godzilla toy would look like if you went and bought it in, I don't know, the 70s, the 80s. I don't know how early this toy came out. Maybe even you could have found one of these in the 60s. But anyway, it's not a bad looking figure. I really like the look of it, but the Shogun Godzilla is another good example of that. I don't have the original Shogun Godzilla, but Super 7 did a ReAction figure recreation of the Shogun Godzilla. So this was a Godzilla figure that was available in the 70s, and you can see how it doesn't really look like Godzilla. It doesn't look like how he appeared in any of the movies. It's just kind of a thing in and of itself. And that's what we got with the Marusan Godzilla. It's definitely, to the average fan, if you showed them this figure, maybe not this one because the white might throw them off, But otherwise, here's the original Marusan Godzilla that Super 7 did. And if you showed anybody this, I'm sure they would say that it was Godzilla. And it's a pretty cool look. Like, I'm glad that we're getting all these kind of oddball versions of Godzilla. I hope that they continue to give us these. I would love to get a reaction figure based on the like animated like 80s cartoon Godzilla, maybe the Marvel comic book from the 70s. That would all be very cool. All these different looks. But yeah, so you can see how these guys stack up. It's the same sculpt, articulation. This guy doesn't even have any head articulation, so that's kind of interesting to note. But his arms, his legs, and his tail, they all move. I do really like the red lips and the pink mouth on this guy. It's kind of strange looking. It just adds to his weirdness factor. Because like this guy didn't have that obvious red lips. He's got some red inside of his mouth. But yeah, it really stands out that they added that paint, especially because he's white. We did get a glow-in-the-dark version of standard Godzilla previously as well. And you can see they didn't put any red in his mouth. So I wouldn't have expected it on this figure either. And there was really no preview of this figure. Oftentimes, I pre-order these figures months in advance, so I kind of seen pictures of them online. I knew what to expect. I had no idea that this figure was coming out. It just showed up on Super 7's website the day that the Wave 2 figures were coming out. So when it arrived at my door, I hadn't really looked at it before. And anyway, it's just super weird looking, and I love it. I love how weird it is. Anyway, before we move on, maybe I should turn off the lights and show you how well this guy glows. Now, I haven't had him in the spotlight for too long here, so he might not be fully powered up. But let's give it a shot. Yeah, now as you can see here, the other Godzilla is glowing much better than the Marusan Godzilla right now. I can barely see this guy. I don't know if you guys can see him at all. But he does glow quite nice. Like, even when I'm seeing him with my naked eye right now, he's glowing pretty well. But when he's exposed to light a little bit more, he definitely glows as good as this guy does. So don't let that throw you off. But anyway, yeah, it's pretty cool. Now, before I move on from Marusan Godzilla, I do have one other kind of little random toy I'm going to talk about and throw into this video. And it's actually pretty good timing. Because my friend Miguel, he went out to like a flea market, essentially, the other day. And he picked me up a toy. He does this occasionally. If he finds something on the cheap, he grabs me something. When he goes away on vacation, he usually brings me back some knickknacks. It's always a very cool surprise. Anyway, it was just last week. We went out for dinner, and he said, "Oh, I picked up something today at the flea market." And he gave me this toy here. And he just knows I'm a Godzilla fan. And somebody was selling this for like $1 or something, and he grabbed it for me. And, he had no idea, for one, that I just got this Marusan Godzilla and I was going to be doing a review on it soon. And as you can see, I think it's pretty obvious how this guy is connected. He ties into that. Now, I don't know exactly what this figure is. There's no markings on it anywhere. I don't know what company made it. I don't know what year it's from. It might very well be a Godzilla made by this Marusan company. Or more likely, it's some sort of knockoff, something you can buy at the dollar store. Like when you buy bags of zoo animals or bags of sea creatures and stuff. I'm going to guess that's what this is. This is kind of a dollar store knockoff version of Godzilla. But I really don't know for sure. If you know, let me know in the comments. But so besides the fact that I am a Godzilla fan, I got this Marusan Godzilla, which this guy I would say is based on. So it was good timing. But besides all that, what Miguel didn't know is that I actually had this exact toy when I was young. I don't know where it came from. I had a whole bag full of those little plastic zoo animals from the dollar store. And I had some plastic dinosaurs and stuff that were mixed in with them. And I had this gray. I didn't really think of it as Godzilla. I guess for one, I wasn't familiar with this whole Marusan concept. And when you look at him, like, he doesn't look like Godzilla from any of the Godzilla films, but I can definitely see how he would be a knockoff Godzilla. I thought he was supposed to be just some weird kind of dinosaur. Plus, I always thought he was hairy. I assumed all these sculpted lines in him were supposed to be hair. I realize now it's probably just supposed to be scales, kind of sculpted oddly, but no matter. Anyway, the funny thing about this guy is back in elementary school, if I'm remembering it correctly, in English we were tasked with writing a storybook about an imaginary friend. I think that was the concept. Anyway, everybody else, I don't remember any of my classmates' story. We're going back a long time now. I don't remember any of their stories. But I wrote a story where I had an imaginary friend, and it wasn't even that he was imaginary, actually. He was just invisible. And my invisible friend was this toy, except it was the size of like a T-Rex. It was a big, giant, invisible, hairy gray dinosaur, and only I could see him. And his name was Hrumph. And so I wrote this story where I can't remember how it went exactly. I don't have it any longer. But I wrote a story where I found this dinosaur, named him Hrumph, and he followed me around, and he would, step on cars and do things and get in trouble, and nobody else could see the dinosaur except me. And I brought him to the classroom with me because he followed me to school, and he was trying to squeeze into my classroom. And in the story, I remember I kind of name dropped all my other classmates to say he stepped on Jamie's desk and he knocked over Scott's book bag, and everybody always got a big kick out of it, and they wanted me to read it in front of the class. And so then the next time we had a writing assignment, which was kind of like pick whatever you want to write about, I wrote another Hrumph story, and I think I ended up writing 3 or 4 of them in total. So when I see this little toy, it's not just some random Godzilla knockoff to me. It immediately reminds me of my old fake imaginary friend, Hrumph, from a line of stories that I wrote when I was in elementary school. I don't know why I got rid of that old dinosaur. I no longer have my original Hrumph. I think, I just got rid of that whole bag of plastic animals and dinosaurs, probably when I was like 12 years old or something. And I didn't really think much of it, that this guy was a little more special and I maybe should have held on to him. But yeah, just very, very bizarre for Miguel to just show up at dinner and hand me this thing and not really know of any of my connections to it. So yeah, thank you very much, Miguel. This is a fun little pick me up, and I definitely won't get rid of him. He's going to go up on my display shelf with all these other guys. And yeah, pretty cool. So just one more shot before we sign off. I want to show you my Super 7 Godzilla reaction figure collection to date. Now, I actually don't have all of them. I think there's 3 or 4 I'm still missing. I don't have one of the Shogun Godzillas. I didn't get the glow-in-the-dark Mothra or Rodan. But otherwise, I've got a pretty close to complete collection, and you can see it's growing pretty rapidly in a very short period of time. It's only been around for about 1.5 years since we got the first wave of figures. Maybe not even that long. Within the year, I guess, probably. And yeah, it's a nice little collection, and I'm looking forward to seeing it grow even more. So that was my review of Super 7's Godzilla reaction figures Wave 2. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please make sure to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave me comments below, and stay tuned for my next video, which I'm sure will be dropping pretty soon. So thanks for watching. See you next time. Ciao.